The storm had barely passed when Clara and Evan stepped into the old cabin, its air still heavy with the smell of wet timber and forgotten years. Their grandfather had always insisted the place remain untouched, as if disturbing it would wake something better left buried. Dust floated like pale ghosts in the light filtering through warped wooden boards, settling over shelves filled with maps, tools, and relics from a life spent mostly in silence. The siblings expected nothing more than a weekend of cleaning and paperwork, yet the sense of being watched seeped into the room the moment they arrived, subtle but persistent, like breath on the back of the neck. It was Evan who found the box, wedged behind the hearthstones, locked with a clasp that had rusted into a stubborn grin. The wood was carved with patterns neither recognized, twisting like roots searching blindly in the dark. Inside lay a single photograph, sepia-toned and fragile, showing a family of 5 posed stiffly in front of a homestead. Their expressions were hollow, their eyes darkened by the limitations of early photography, but something about them felt wrong, as though none had truly wanted to be captured at that moment in time. Clara brushed away the film of dust, and the faint outlines of trees behind the family became visible, warped trunks, tangled branches, a forest that felt disturbingly familiar. Evan held his phone over the picture, zooming in with idle curiosity, until his finger froze. At first they thought it was a smudge, a flaw in the aging print, but as the pixels sharpened, the shape in the background solidified, a figure standing between the trees, impossibly tall, its limbs too slender, its posture too rigid, its face a smear of shadow. The two siblings exchanged a look that carried both confusion and a quiet dread. The photograph trembled slightly in Clara's hands as she whispered that she recognized those trees. The crooked birch. The split oak. The moss-covered stump. They weren't just any woods, they were the woods surrounding the very cabin they were standing in. Evan tried to laugh it off, but the sound died quickly in the stale air. The cabin seemed to grow colder, as though the walls themselves were leaning closer, listening. Outside, the trees swayed with slow, reluctant movements, branches creaking like old bones. Clara looked back down at the photograph and felt her skin crawl. Whoever, or whatever, stood in those woods in 1878 wasn't just part of a forgotten past. Something about the image made her certain of it. It was still out there. And now, after all these years, it knew they had seen it. The moment Clara and Evan stumble upon the 1878 photograph, an object that seems harmless at first glance but carries an unsettling weight the moment it touches the light. As they sort through piles of their grandfather's belongings in the dim cabin, the siblings expect nothing unusual, only paperwork, keepsakes, and forgotten tools from a long life spent in isolation. But the discovery of the sealed wooden box interrupts the ordinary rhythm of the afternoon. The box itself feels strangely deliberate, hidden behind the hearthstones as if their grandfather wanted it close but not openly visible. Its carvings, swirling like tangled roots, hint at something older than the wood it was made from, something carved with intention rather than decoration. When Evan pries it open, the hinges release a soft groan, like a sigh of relief or warning, and inside lies a single photograph wrapped in brittle fabric, preserved with an unusual care for something so old. The photo shows a family neither Clara nor Evan recognizes, seated stiffly in front of a small homestead with expressions that suggest the moment captured was not one they willingly participated in. The father's grip on his youngest child's shoulder is tight, not in affection but in restraint. The mother's eyes, although shadowed by the limitations of early photography, seem full of dread rather than pride. The children appear uneasy, their tiny bodies rigid as though they were told to hold perfectly still or face consequences not captured in the image. Clara feels a strange heaviness settle over her as she studies the faces, an inexplicable sorrow mingled with a sense of warning, as if the people in the photograph were silently pleading for their discovery to mean something. The sepia tones hide none of the discomfort radiating from the captured scene, and the siblings' interest shifts from casual curiosity to something deeper, something tinged with the quiet fear of uncovering a truth they didn't realize was buried. Evan holds the photograph up to the light, letting the details sharpen, the rough wood of the house behind the family, the dirt ground beneath their boots, the faint outlines of trees behind them. Even without noticing the figure that will soon disrupt their sense of reality, the photograph already feels wrong. The atmosphere of the image suggests a moment frozen not for memory but for containment, as if what stood behind the camera was far more threatening than what stood in front of it. The discovery marks not just the beginning of a mystery but the opening of a door their grandfather had kept closed for reasons they are only beginning to understand, setting a quiet unease between them as they continue to examine the relic that will soon unravel everything they thought they knew about the cabin, the woods, and the history buried beneath their family's past. When Clara and Evan zoom in on the photograph and notice the unusual figure in the background, the atmosphere in the cabin shifts from mild unease to something far heavier, a tension that neither of them can easily dismiss. At first, the silhouette seems like nothing more than a smudge on the old print, an imperfection typical of photographs taken in the 19th century. But as the camera sharpens the details, the smudge begins to take form in a way that makes their skin prickle. Standing between the trees, partially obscured by the dense shadows of the woods, is a figure that does not resemble anything human. Its posture is unnaturally straight, its head tilted at an angle too precise to be natural, and its limbs appear elongated, giving the impression that it could stretch beyond the limits of its blurred outline. The darkness around it does not behave like ordinary shadow, it clings to the figure, almost pulsing with a presence that feels intentional, as though the figure is aware of being observed even through the decades that separate the photograph from the present moment. As the siblings stare, the sense of wrongness deepens. Human figures in old photographs often blurred due to movement or the limitations of early cameras, yet this figure is perfectly still, too still, as if frozen in a pose that was never meant to be captured. Clara feels an involuntary shiver crawl up her spine as she realizes the figure stands a good distance behind the family, yet its form remains disproportionately large, suggesting either a strange perspective or an unnatural height. Evan tries to rationalize it as a trick of light or damage to the photograph, but the more he zooms, the clearer the outline becomes. The trees around the figure are warped as if bending away from it, and the ground beneath its feet seems darker, like the earth itself recoiled from contact. Clara notices the absence of any facial features, replaced instead by a void that absorbs rather than reflects light. The face, if it can be called that, gives no hint of emotion, yet the overwhelming feeling it evokes is one of being watched by something that does not blink, breathe, or move. The longer they look at the figure, the more oppressive the silence in the cabin becomes. It feels as if the walls are listening, as if something outside is listening too. They both sense that this is not a case of a mysterious bystander accidentally caught in an old photograph. The figure seems deliberate, positioned in a way that suggests it was meant to be there, meant to be noticed eventually, meant to be found by them specifically. In that moment, the siblings understand that the photograph is not just an eerie relic from the past but the beginning of something reaching out from the shadows of history into their present reality, and neither can shake the feeling that the figure's gaze has followed them long after they lower the photo and look away. Realizing that the background of the photograph matches the forest behind their grandfather's cabin marks the moment when the mystery shifts from distant curiosity to immediate danger. What had seemed like an odd, unsettling detail in an old picture suddenly becomes something intimately connected to their present surroundings. As Clara studies the photograph again, her breath catches when she notices the distinctive curve of a crooked birch tree near the edge of the image. She has seen that tree countless times on walks behind the cabin, the way its trunk bends sideways before reaching upward, the way its bark peels in thin, papery strips like curling fingernails. It is too unique to be a coincidence. When she points it out to Evan, he hesitates, searching the image with narrowed eyes, then slowly nods as recognition settles in. A chill creeps through the room, the kind that sinks beneath the skin rather than brushes across it. They begin comparing more elements. The split oak that appears just behind the family in the photograph matches the one behind the cabin, with its trunk divided into two uneven halves like a mouth tearing open. The moss-covered stump in the background of the image has the same irregular shape as the one Clara tripped over as a child. The alignment of the trees, the density of the brush, even the faint path cutting through the undergrowth all point to the same place. It becomes impossible to deny that the photograph was taken in these very woods, perhaps within a short walk from where they stand now. This revelation pulls the figure in the background out of the realm of distant history and plants it firmly into the soil around them. Whatever stood behind that family in 1878 once walked the same path behind the cabin, breathed the same cold air, and cast its shadow across the same forest floor that now lies silent beyond the cabin walls. The woods outside suddenly feel less like nature and more like an extension of the photograph itself, as though time has thinned and the boundary between past and present is weaker here. Clara finds herself glancing at the window, half expecting to see that blurred silhouette standing between the trees, its featureless face pointed toward the cabin. Evan, trying to maintain composure, suggests it might simply be coincidence or that the woods all look similar, but his voice carries a tremor that betrays his doubt. Their grandfather spent decades living beside this forest, and now they wonder whether he knew more than he ever said. The realization casts a long, heavy shadow over the room, wrapping around them like the dense canopy outside. With every passing second, the cabin feels smaller, the woods feel closer, and the photograph in Clara's hands feels less like a relic and more like a warning left behind by someone who understood the danger far too well. The discovery of the second photograph begins with a sound so small that Clara and Evan almost ignore it, a faint thud from the shelf near the back of the cabin, followed by the soft slide of something hitting the floor. At first, they assume it is just the building settling, another groan from the old wooden walls tired of holding up the past. But when Clara turns toward the noise, she sees a dusty picture frame lying face down on the floor, as if it had been pushed rather than simply fallen. The air in the room thickens as she walks over to it, the faint scent of aged paper drifting up as she lifts the frame. Her fingers feel the weight of it, heavier than she would expect for something so old, as if it carries more than just a photograph inside. Evan watches silently from across the room, his apprehension growing as she turns the frame over. The moment the photograph inside is revealed, a cold wave rolls through both of them. It is another old family picture, taken years after the first, but unmistakably connected. The same homestead stands in the background, though the wood appears more weathered, and the family looks slightly older, their expressions more strained, as if whatever shadow hung over them in the first image has tightened around them over time. The children, once merely uncomfortable, now seem fearful. The mother's eyes hold a quiet desperation, the father's posture has stiffened into something rigid, protective, or perhaps resigned. But it is not the family's transformation that steals the breath from Clara's lungs, it is the presence behind them. The figure is there again, but this time much closer. No longer a faint blur in the distant tree line, it stands mere steps behind the family, its elongated form sharper, its silhouette more defined. The absence of a face is even more disturbing now that it is nearer, a void of shadow that seems to swallow the light around it. The trees behind the figure appear slightly warped, as though the forest itself bends away from whatever stands among them. The figure's arms hang in unnatural proportions, too long, too still, with a rigidity that gives the impression of a puppet held by invisible strings. The entity's presence in the second photo feels deliberate, as if it wanted to be seen, as if it is slowly stepping out of obscurity and into recognition. Clara grips the frame tighter, her pulse quickening as she realizes the implications. This wasn't a one-time capture of an unknown passerby, this was a recurrence, a pattern, something that had lingered near the family long enough for multiple photographs to record its existence. Evan leans in, and the dread in his expression tells her he sees it too. The figure has moved closer between the two photographs, closing the distance with a patience that feels unnatural. The discovery of the second image turns their unease into a quiet terror, suggesting that whatever appeared behind that long-dead family did not simply remain in the past. It had approached them once, then again, and the evidence of its slow, deliberate advance lies now in their hands, whispering a warning their grandfather may have never been able to voice. Finding their grandfather's hidden journal deepens the mystery in a way neither Clara nor Evan is prepared for, transforming their lingering unease into something far more personal. It happens after the discovery of the second photograph, when a restless silence settles over the cabin. Evan, needing something to distract himself from the image burned into his mind, begins pacing across the wooden floor. His steps echo strangely, one patch of the floor sounding hollow compared to the rest. Clara kneels down beside him, presses her palm against the uneven board, and feels a slight give beneath her hand. When they pry it up, a plume of dust escapes like a sigh, and beneath the floor lies a narrow compartment carved neatly into the foundation. Inside rests a journal wrapped in oilcloth, protected from time, as though their grandfather expected someone, specifically someone from the family, to find it long after he was gone. The journal is thick, its leather cover cracked and stiff, the pages yellowed but meticulously filled with writing. As Clara opens it, she immediately recognizes their grandfather's steady handwriting, though the tone of his entries is nothing like the men she knew. Instead of simple notes about hunting trips or repairs around the property, the pages are filled with observations of the woods, written with an unsettling precision. He describes seeing someone standing among the trees at dusk, a shape too tall to be human, unmoving despite the wind shaking the branches around it. At first, he assumed it was a trick of fading light, but entry after entry reveals a growing fear he tried desperately to control. Some pages document nights when he woke to the sensation of being watched, only to find a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, always in the same position, always facing the cabin. He writes about the way it seemed to grow clearer with each sighting, its silhouette sharpening as though it were becoming more real with every passing year. On several pages, words have been scratched out violently, the ink smudged as if his hands trembled while writing. One entry mentions finding an old photograph buried under the cabin, the same one Clara and Evan discovered, and realizing the figure he saw was the same apparition captured behind the family from 1878. He writes about his attempts to track it, only to discover that it never left footprints, never shifted position unless unobserved, and never appeared in the same place twice. As Clara reads aloud, Evan feels the room tighten, the shadows deepen, and the temperature drop just slightly. Each word their grandfather wrote feels like a confession he was too afraid to speak. Through the journal, they begin to understand that he didn't isolate himself out of preference, he did it out of fear. He stayed because something in the woods would not let him leave, something that watched him grow old and waited with a patience no living thing should possess. The moment they hear footsteps in the night marks the point where fear stops being tied to old photographs and begins breathing in the present. After reading their grandfather's journal, Clara and Evan sit in heavy silence, the cabin's air thick with the weight of every unsettling detail he left behind. The old wood creaks softly around them, but those familiar sounds now feel sharper, more threatening, as if the building itself is reacting to the memories being brought back to life. Evan tries to reassure them both that the journal entries could have been the product of isolation or paranoia, but even as he speaks, the argument feels weak. The descriptions were too detailed, too consistent, too hauntingly similar to what they themselves had noticed in the photographs. Clara can't shake the feeling that their grandfather was not imagining things, he was documenting them. Night settles over the cabin with an eerie stillness, the kind that makes every far-off rustle echo louder than usual. The wind whistles through the trees outside, but even that natural sound seems strained, as if the forest is holding its breath. They try to distract themselves by organizing their grandfather's belongings, but their thoughts keep drifting back to the figure, the journal, the realization that the woods behind the cabin have held something unnatural for generations. When Evan suggests they try to sleep, Clara hesitates, feeling a quiet dread she can't explain. Still, exhaustion eventually pulls them into a fragile rest. It is sometime past midnight when the first sound reaches them. A faint crunch of dry leaves outside the cabin window, deliberate and slow, unmistakably the sound of footsteps. Evan's eyes snap open, and he holds his breath, waiting to hear if it was just an animal wandering near the clearing. But then it comes again, a measured step, heavier this time, as though whoever is walking knows exactly where they are and wants to be heard. Clara sits up, her pulse pounding in her ears, and the two lock eyes without speaking, both understanding instantly that this is not a fox or deer passing by. The footsteps are too paced, too intentional, too human in rhythm yet somehow wrong in weight and cadence. The footsteps stop at the side of the cabin, right by the wall where Clara remembers the figure standing in the first photograph. The silence that follows is unbearable, pressing against their ears like a physical force. Evan slowly approaches the window but stops short, afraid of what he might see staring back from the darkness. Clara grips the edge of the bed, certain she can feel the presence from the photographs now standing just outside the thin wooden wall, listening to them breathe. The night feels alive with a watchful stillness, as if something ancient and patient has finally stepped from the shadows of history and found its way to their door, answering a summons they never intended to send. When Clara and Evan zoom into the 1878 photograph one more time and realize the figure's face now resembles someone they know, the horror of their situation crystallizes in a way far more personal and devastating than anything they had imagined. After the footsteps outside fade into an oppressive silence, neither of them can bring themselves to move for several minutes. The cabin feels suspended in a moment of breathless anticipation, the darkness pressing against the windows like a living thing waiting for permission to slip inside. Evan finally suggests they take another look at the photographs, hoping, desperately, that perhaps exhaustion and fear have twisted their perceptions. Clara hesitates, her hands trembling at the thought of examining the images again, but something inside her insists that understanding the truth is the only way to reclaim even a shred of control. They gather both photographs on the table, the dim lamplight casting long, nervous shadows. When Evan lifts his phone and zooms in on the first photo, he notices something immediately. The figure in the background looks clearer than before. Not fully defined, not entirely human, but no longer a vague blur lost in the trees. Clara leans in, her breath catching as the pixels settle into sharper contrast. It shouldn't be possible for an old, deteriorating photograph to spontaneously reveal new details, yet here it is, the shadowed void where the figure's face should be now has subtle contours, faint but undeniable signs of a human structure beneath the darkness. A cheekbone. A hint of a jawline. The suggestion of an eye socket that is not empty but deeply recessed, as though something is beginning to emerge from behind a veil. As Clara continues to zoom, her chest tightens with a cold, rising dread. The shape of the face is hauntingly familiar, something she cannot immediately place but knows on an instinctive level she has seen before. Evan watches her expression shift from confusion to horror, and when she finally speaks, her voice is barely a whisper. She recognizes the structure of the jaw, the slope of the forehead, the faint imprint of a smile line that once held warmth. It resembles their grandfather, not in full, not completely, but enough that the implication sinks into their bones with a chilling certainty. The figure's face appears to be forming into his, as though the entity had studied him over time, absorbing pieces of his likeness, or perhaps reflecting him in a way neither of them can comprehend. Evan scrolls to the second photograph, and the resemblance becomes even more pronounced. The creature's evolving features echo their grandfather's aging face, twisted into something hollow, stretched, and devoid of life. Clara feels the ground tilt beneath her as an unbearable possibility takes shape. Whatever watched their grandfather for decades did more than observe, it mimicked, learned, and perhaps even fed on his presence. The realization that the face looking back at them may be an imitation of the men they once loved, shaped by something that should not exist, strikes them with a terror deeper than anything they have encountered. The figure in the woods is no longer a nameless apparition from the past, it has become tied to their family, their bloodline, their history. And now that they have recognized its face, they cannot escape the feeling that it has been waiting for them to do exactly that.